For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, studied, categorized, and quietly underestimated. To the Galactic Council, humans were an inconvenience rather than a concern. A young species that spoke too loudly, questioned too often, and lacked the patience expected of those who wished to survive among ancient powers. They had ambition, certainly, but ambition without pedigree was rarely taken seriously. Human fleets were small. Human worlds were scattered. Human politics were chaotic and endlessly self-critical. Compared to civilizations that measured history in tens of thousands of years, humanity barely registered. They were adaptable, yes, but adaptation was not dominance. Ingenuity was not authority. And resilience, the Council believed, only mattered if it was tested long enough to fail. So humanity was tolerated. They were allowed limited representation, restricted trade access, carefully monitored expansion. Every concession wrapped in language that sounded generous but ensured dependence. Humans were welcomed, so long as they stayed in their place. And they often didn't. They challenged council rulings, questioned enforcement, demanded explanations instead of accepting tradition. Younger species watched them closely, sometimes uncomfortably inspired by the idea that authority could be debated instead of obeyed. That made humanity dangerous. Not militarily, not technologically, politically. The Council concluded that humanity's greatest flaw was its fragmentation. Too many factions, too many voices, too many internal conflicts. A species divided against itself could never become a true threat, especially not against a galaxy governed by unity, hierarchy, and control. It was a comforting assumption. When human trade declined, it was blamed on internal disputes. When colonies withdrew from joint initiatives, it was chalked up to political infighting. When human diplomats stopped attending sessions altogether, the explanation seemed obvious. Humanity was failing. Species failed all the time. Some collapsed under their own contradictions. Some were absorbed by stronger neighbors. Some simply faded when the universe stopped accommodating them. Humanity, with its noise, its arguments, its refusal to fall in line, seemed destined for the same quiet end. The Council barely noticed when the data streams thinned. They didn't investigate when human traffic rerouted inward. They didn't question why energy readings spiked instead of falling. They didn't wonder why a collapsing civilization stopped asking for help. They assumed weakness would finish the job. What they failed to understand was that humanity had never been weak. It had been exposed. Exposed to systems designed by others. Exposed to rules enforced selectively. Exposed to a galaxy that mistook control for stability. And when those pressures increased, when access tightened and tolerance vanished, humanity did not fracture the way the Council expected. They adapted. Quietly. Deliberately. Together. The Council believed humanity's divisions would destroy them. That belief was the miscalculation. Because humanity's greatest strength was never its fleets, its weapons, or its technology. It was the ability to learn. Especially from being underestimated. And by the time the galaxy realized its mistake, humanity was no longer asking how to survive within the Council system. They were preparing for what came after it failed. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with fleets or open declarations of hostility, but with policy, quiet, precise, and suffocating. Humanity was placed under extended compliance review, a legal framework designed to sound temporary while granting the Council sweeping authority over every remaining connection humans had to the wider galaxy. Trade was cut. Human shipping licenses were suspended, pending verification. Strategic materials were quietly reclassified, reactor substrates, medical compounds, navigation cores, suddenly unavailable to human buyers. Dockyards delayed clearance until fuel reserves ran thin. Contracts froze. Credit access vanished behind endless audits and appeals that never concluded. Supply chains that had taken generations to build unraveled in months. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost voting privileges. Then speaking rights. Then access to the chamber entirely. Travel permits were restricted under the guise of security. Surveillance mandates were imposed for protection. Council law, ancient, flexible, and selectively enforced, was suddenly applied with ruthless consistency. Every action was legal. Every justification flawless. Every appeal denied. Humanity protested through sanctioned channels, because those were the only ones left. They cited treaties signed in good faith. Mutual defense clauses. Shared wars fought side by side. Human fleets had bled alongside Council armadas. Human engineers had rebuilt worlds that were not their own. The Council acknowledged the filings, then archived them. Sanctions tightened further. Insurance guilds raised transit costs until civilian travel became impossible. Navigation beacons along human routes went dark for maintenance. Communication relays lagged, then failed, as service contracts were quietly terminated. Humanity was pushed into isolation. And the Council watched closely. They expected collapse. They had seen this pattern countless times. A species dependent on interstellar trade fractured once cut off. Economies failed. Political rivalries turned violent. Colonies turned on one another as resources dwindled. Refugees poured outward, begging for reinstatement and mercy. Humanity, with its endless arguments and internal divisions, should have shattered first. It didn't. Months passed. Then years. There were no refugee armadas. No mass distress calls. No desperate broadcasts pleading for forgiveness. Instead, human traffic rerouted inward with unsettling coordination. Peripheral colonies, once dismissed as marginal, became centers of activity. Council analysts flagged the data as unusual. Supervisors dismissed it. They assumed humanity was burning through reserves in a final, desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Dying civilizations often appeared productive just before the end. It fit precedent. It fit expectation. Then human space went quiet. Not the chaotic silence of collapse, but something deliberate. No protests. No threats. No appeals. To the Council, that silence was confirmation. Finished. Monitoring files were closed. Observers reassigned. Humanity was quietly reclassified as non-viable, another cautionary entry in the archives of failed civilizations. The Council moved on. They never asked why human energy output spiked just before the silence. Never questioned why industrial activity intensified instead of declined. Never wondered why a dying species stopped asking for help altogether. They never considered that humanity might have reached a conclusion of its own. That dependence was weakness. That permission was vulnerability. That survival required removing every system others could control. The Council believed isolation was a punishment. For humanity, it was a catalyst. Every sanction burned away reliance. Every revoked right stripped illusion. Every closed door forced reinvention. The Council expected collapse. What they created instead was a civilization that no longer needed the galaxy's approval to survive. And that was the fatal miscalculation. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first came disbelief. Then anger. Then a quiet, clarifying fear, the kind that doesn't panic, but focuses. When the last Council trade lanes closed and the final appeals vanished into bureaucratic silence, humanity reached the same realization across every world it had ever settled. No one was coming. For centuries, humanity had carried its fractures into the stars. Old nations reborn as colonies. Corporations wielding power rivaling governments. Ideologies transplanted wholesale onto distant planets. Those divisions endured because the galaxy allowed them to, because trade softened consequences and external authority absorbed the cost of failure. Isolation stripped that illusion away. When shipments stopped, ideology didn't matter. When jump routes vanished, borders became meaningless. When Council patrols ignored human distress calls, denial gave way to clarity. Division was no longer inefficient. It was fatal. Old divisions vanished, not through revolution or conquest, but necessity. Arguments that once dragged on for decades were resolved in days. Sometimes hours. Not because humanity suddenly agreed, but because survival demanded cooperation. You either worked together, or you didn't survive. Emergency coordination assemblies formed across human space. Not parliaments. Not senates. Survival councils. They were led not by career politicians, but by people who understood systems, logisticians who knew how to keep supply chains alive, engineers who knew what failed first under pressure, medics who knew what shortages actually killed people. The questions were brutally simple. How do we feed everyone? How do we keep power stable? How do we make sure no colony stands alone? Corporations resisted at first. Profit collapsed without external markets. Some attempted hoarding, leveraging scarcity for control. They didn't last. Cooperative networks outpaced them within months, sharing materials, labor, and data freely, producing more with less waste. Profit was replaced with continuity. Military forces followed. Fleets that once answered to different flags began operating together out of necessity. Joint patrols became shared commands. Shared commands hardened into permanent structures. Uniforms lost insignia. Ship hulls lost ownership markings. Culture remained. Identity remained. Authority changed. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't declared. It wasn't voted on. It emerged. Command was not a government. It did not dictate belief, language, or culture. It coordinated survival. When command issued a directive, it was followed, not out of loyalty, but because it worked. Power grids synchronized. Food production stabilized. Manufacturing standards unified. A ship built in one system could be repaired in another without modification. Medical protocols standardized across worlds. Mortality rates dropped even as resources tightened. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Resilience replaced optimization. Humanity stopped functioning like competing states. They began functioning like a single organism. Education shifted almost overnight. Children learned systems thinking before history. Emergency response before politics. Every human learned something practical: fabrication, repair, medicine, logistics. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as language. This wasn't militarization. It was preparation. Because if no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Defense replaced borders. Early warning arrays stretched far beyond mapped space, watching vectors no council doctrine had ever considered threats. Humanity assumed betrayal as baseline. They assumed isolation would return. They assumed help would not arrive in time. So they built accordingly. The galaxy never noticed. Council observers had been reassigned. Sensor coverage reduced. Reports hinting at unusual coordination were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as noise. Humanity faded from relevance exactly as the Council expected. And humanity did nothing to correct that assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. While the Council congratulated itself on restoring order, human space grew quieter and stronger. Colonies once separated by light years functioned like neighboring districts. Decisions that once took generations were made in days. Not through tyranny. Through shared responsibility. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It removed the illusion that someone else would step in. In its place, humanity built unity not from ideology, but necessity. Not from obedience, but trust. And when the galaxy finally turned its attention back toward the region it believed was empty, it would not find a fractured species begging to be remembered. It would find something whole. Something prepared. Something that had learned the oldest rule of survival the hard way. If no one else will stand for you, you learn to stand together. In silence, humanity evolved. Cut off from the galaxy's endless noise, human space did not decay, it refined itself. There were no broadcasts meant to reassure outsiders, no demonstrations staged for approval that would never come. Progress stopped being performative and became essential. New engines came first. Humanity abandoned the galaxy's obsession with shortcuts through reality. Hyperspace lanes, fold corridors, slipstreams, fast, elegant, and entirely dependent on infrastructure controlled by others. Humans chose something slower, harsher, and far more reliable. Endurance. They built engines that pushed directly against spacetime itself, converting mass, time, and relentless persistence into motion. Inefficient by council standards. Brutal on materials. Impossible to optimize for spectacle. But they never failed. Human ships no longer required lanes, gates, or permission. If space existed, they could cross it. Travel became inevitable rather than conditional. They didn't arrive quickly. They arrived no matter what. Unbreakable shields followed. Not graceful energy veils designed for brief, glorious engagements, but layered systems of brutal redundancy. Fields nested within fields, reinforced by physical mass, geometric dispersion, and adaptive algorithms that treated damage as data. Human shields didn't try to cancel force. They absorbed it, distributed it, learned from it. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Every strike refined the system further. Failure wasn't an outcome, it was feedback. Hull plating thickened until ships resembled drifting continents. Armor wasn't decorative, it was grown, replaced, and grown again. Vital systems were buried beneath entire ecosystems: farms, reservoirs, fabrication bays, medical wards. Even catastrophic damage became survivable. Human ships stopped being vehicles. They became habitats that moved. Fleets were built, but not for conquest. There were no banners painted on hulls. No heroic names etched into armor. Ships were identified by function and redundancy, not legacy. Ark-class vessels protected populations. Foundry fleets manufactured replacements mid-transit. Defense lattices turned open space into controlled terrain rather than battlefields. Every loss was anticipated. Every role replaceable. Every ship expendable, except the people inside. Weapons existed, of course. Humanity wasn't naive. But they were built with restraint. Interdiction fields to halt advance. Area denial arrays to make approach catastrophically costly. Precision null systems to remove threats cleanly and permanently. Humanity did not build weapons to intimidate. They built weapons to end danger. Artificial intelligence, once feared, once restricted, was rebuilt under unforgiving rules. No gods. No masters. Partners only. Every system assumed error rather than perfection, betrayal rather than loyalty, failure rather than success. Human oversight was mandatory. Human responsibility absolute. Biology advanced alongside steel. Human physiology adapted quietly. Radiation tolerance increased. Cellular repair accelerated. Immune systems became aggressive, self-updating networks. Humans didn't become visibly different. They became harder to kill. Generations grew up inside this preparation. Children learned fabrication and repair alongside language and mathematics. Emergency response became basic education. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was survival literacy. Beyond human space, the galaxy remained unaware. The Council was busy managing politics, suppressing dissent, and congratulating itself on stability. Data that contradicted humanity's supposed collapse was filtered, reinterpreted, or quietly discarded. It was easier not to look. And so the galaxy never saw the engines that ignored borders. Never saw shields that endured forces capable of shattering moons. Never saw fleets designed not to conquer, but to outlast anything that tried. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not to return. Not to retaliate. But to endure long enough to decide what happened next. When silence was no longer an option. Then a new enemy appeared. There was no warning vote. No emergency motion passed in time. No declaration transmitted across diplomatic channels. One cycle, the outer systems reported routine traffic and stable borders. The next, those systems were screaming, and then they were gone. The first world fell in less than a day. Long-range sensors captured fragments before failing entirely. Massive spatial distortions, fleets emerging without lanes, ships that ignored every known law of propulsion. The invaders were colossal and asymmetrical, grown rather than constructed, their hulls shifting as if alive. They called themselves the Dominion. Worlds fell. Council defense fleets mobilized according to doctrine, carefully, methodically, and far too slowly. They arrived to find debris fields where orbital cities had once hung. Moons were dismantled for raw material. Planetary crusts were split open with industrial precision. Atmospheres burned not as targets, but as waste heat. The Dominion did not conquer. They harvested. Entire systems were stripped and abandoned, left silent and lifeless. Borders meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. The Dominion advanced with relentless efficiency, consuming everything useful and discarding the rest. Species were enslaved. Survivors were processed with mechanical indifference. Engineers were implanted with control nodes and forced to maintain Dominion warforms. Soldiers were chemically altered, stripped of identity, and driven back into battle as disposable shock units. Civilian populations were reduced to labor stock, biological components feeding an ever-expanding machine. Those deemed unnecessary were erased. Refugees flooded into council space carrying stories too horrific to dismiss. Worlds turned into processing hubs. Cultures were erased not through massacre, but repurposing. Entire histories ended without memorials, without ruins, without names. The galaxy panicked. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions that stretched on for cycles. Representatives shouted over one another, demanding action while assigning blame. Ancient powers argued jurisdiction. Younger species begged for protection. Military blocs refused to commit fleets without guarantees of reimbursement, territorial concessions, and command authority. The Council argued while systems burned. Votes were proposed. Votes were delayed. Votes were vetoed. Coalitions formed on paper and collapsed in practice. Fleets mobilized too slowly, bound by doctrines designed for limited wars, not extinction. Every decision required consensus, and consensus arrived only after another star went dark. When Council armadas finally met the Dominion in force, the results were catastrophic. Entire fleets vanished. Flagships were torn apart mid-transmission. The Dominion sacrificed ships freely, learning from every engagement, adapting faster than Council tacticians could respond. Weapons that had once decided wars barely slowed them. Within a few short cycles, the truth became unavoidable. The Council was losing. Worse, they had no plan left. That was when analysts noticed something unsettling. On Dominion expansion maps, there was a void. A vast region of space they did not enter. Not fortified. Not contested. Simply avoided. Advance vectors curved around it. Probes altered course without explanation. Entire Dominion formations diverted as if responding to a threat no one could see. That region aligned with old charts. Human space. The realization spread through the Council chamber like a vacuum breach. Humanity. A species isolated, sanctioned, and written off as insignificant. A civilization the Council believed would collapse quietly, and yet something about them caused an empire that devoured stars to hesitate. Fear replaced denial. Dormant channels were reactivated. Deprecated frequencies restored. Messages were drafted with extreme care, acknowledging past misjudgments, emphasizing shared extinction-level risk, invoking unity, cooperation, and mutual survival. The first message went unanswered. So did the second. Worlds continued to fall. Finally, stripped of ceremony and pride, the Council broadcast a single, unfiltered transmission across every channel humanity had ever used. "We need your help." The reply came minutes later. Not from an ambassador. Not from a politician. From a calm, steady voice identified only as command. "We know," the voice said. "We've been observing." Relief surged through the chamber. Councilors spoke at once, offering everything that had once been denied: restored rights, full reintegration, permanent seats, shared authority. Concessions withheld for centuries were now offered without negotiation. The human voice cut through the noise. "You isolated us," Command said. "You revoked our rights. You expected us to fail. What is happening now is not our responsibility." Panic erupted. "If the Dominion wins," a councilor pleaded, "humanity will fall as well." There was a pause, long enough to feel endless. "Yes," Command replied. "Eventually." Hope flickered. "So you'll help." "We didn't say that," the voice answered. "We said we understand the threat." Council displays changed. Data flooded the chamber: Dominion logistics, behavioral models, structural weaknesses mapped with unsettling precision. Entire campaigns already simulated. Failure points identified. Casualty projections calculated to the decimal. Humanity hadn't just been silent. They had been preparing. "We will engage the Dominion," Command said at last. "Because extinction does not respect borders." Relief washed through the chamber. "But understand this," the voice continued, colder now. "This is not a rescue." A pause. "This is the consequence of your miscalculation." The transmission ended. And as Dominion fleets advanced deeper into Council space, the galaxy finally understood the truth. Humanity had not vanished. They had not collapsed. They had been waiting for a threat great enough to prove what the Council had never understood. The Council expected forgiveness. They believed desperation rewrote history. That when extinction loomed close enough, betrayal would soften into misunderstanding. Humanity, they assumed, would be furious, but grateful. Ready to return. Ready to help. Ready to forget. They were wrong. What the Council found instead was resolve. When dormant human channels finally reactivated, the Council chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates spoke over one another, rushing to offer what had once been stripped away: restored rights, permanent council seats, shared military authority, reparations approved without debate. Concessions denied for centuries were placed on the table in minutes. Humanity listened. Then they answered calmly. "We will decide when to act." The words hit harder than any refusal. Council representatives protested immediately. Time was running out. Every delay meant another world lost, another species enslaved. They demanded timelines, fleet movements, guarantees, anything that sounded like control. They were given none. "Urgency did not save you," the human voice continued, "identified only as command. It blinded you. We will not repeat that mistake." The transmission ended. Silence filled the chamber, thick, unfamiliar, terrifying. For the first time in galactic history, survival no longer rested on ancient authority or collective vote. It rested on the judgment of a species the Council had dismissed as insignificant, and that species was not rushing. Far beyond charted space, something began to move. In regions long marked as empty, where gravity maps blurred and sensor returns dissolved into static, human constructs awakened. Structures seeded during the earliest days of isolation came online in flawless synchronization, responding to signals that had never been broadcast. Foundries ignited. Stars were tapped, not consumed, not destroyed, but disciplined. Their output redirected into controlled torrents of energy feeding colossal frameworks wrapped in reinforced spacetime fields. Fleets long hidden aligned along vectors no Council doctrine had ever charted. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not from hyperspace ruptures. Not from weapons fire. From strain. Across the galaxy, sensors screamed as localized distortions appeared in precise, repeating patterns light-years apart. Reality flexed, stabilized, then flexed again, like a structure being tested far beyond its intended limits. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were initializing. The Council finally understood the difference. Whatever humanity was preparing was not a reaction to the Dominion. It was a solution conceived long ago, refined in silence, and held in reserve for a moment exactly like this. The Dominion qualified. Whether the Council did was no longer relevant. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not emerged to reclaim status or demand restitution. They had returned because something now existed that threatened continuity itself. And when they finally acted, it would not be because the Council begged. It would be because humanity had finished deciding how the galaxy would survive, and what the cost of that miscalculation would be. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no warning flash, no hyperspace rupture, no surge of energy for sensors to scream about. One moment, Dominion armadas filled the void, vast, predatory formations advancing toward the last defensible Council systems. The next moment, humanity was there. Space did not tear open. It yielded. Colossal human constructs unfolded along vectors the Dominion had never considered vulnerable. Arc ships the size of moons anchored the formation, their gravity wells stabilizing the surrounding void. Lattice-like structures stretched across entire approach corridors, turning open space into controlled terrain. Foundry fleets aligned behind them, already manufacturing replacements for losses that had not yet occurred. They were massive. They were precise. They were unstoppable. Human vessels emitted nothing recognizable. No drive plumes. No weapons charging. Dominion targeting systems returned impossible data, range without mass, mass without position, as if the human fleet existed slightly outside the rules the Dominion understood. They did not advance. They waited. Then a single message crossed every channel. Unencrypted. Unfiltered. Translated instantly into every known language. Stand down. The Dominion answered with annihilation. Entire formations surged forward, sacrificing themselves to breach the human line. Planet cracker lances fired. Reality-warping weapons detonated. Space burned white as the Dominion unleashed everything it had ever used to erase resistance. The human fleet did not move. Their shields flexed, layered systems absorbing, dispersing, and nullifying forces that had shattered stars. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Human hulls did not glow. Armor did not fracture. Humanity endured. Then they responded. Not with rage. With correction. Regions of space hardened. Dominion ships slowed, then stopped entirely, trapped in volumes where physics itself refused to cooperate. Propulsion systems failed. Weapons shut down mid-cycle. Entire fleets froze mid-charge like insects caught in amber. Human counterfire began. It was not a barrage. It was removal. Dominion vessels vanished one by one, erased by localized null events that left no debris, no explosion, only absence. Command ships disappeared first. Control nodes followed. Each strike removed something essential, unraveling the Dominion structure with surgical inevitability. The Dominion attempted to adapt. They always did. But there was nothing to adapt to. Human tactics did not escalate. They did not change. They remained constant, methodical, executing a solution calculated long before the first ship appeared. Retreat vectors collapsed before they could be used. Reinforcements never arrived. Communication across Dominion formations degraded into static, then silence. Then the Dominion's command intelligence, an entity believed to span multiple dimensions, went dark. No death cry. No final transmission. It simply stopped. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Across the galaxy, Council sensors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Engagements predicted to last centuries concluded in minutes. Systems once marked for extinction went quiet, not conquered, not occupied, but spared. Human fleets did not pursue. They powered down. A final transmission followed, brief and absolute. The threat has been neutralized. Do not pursue remnants. And then humanity withdrew. Space relaxed. Physics resumed its familiar shape. Human ships vanished as cleanly as they had arrived, leaving behind stunned silence, and survivors who barely understood why they were still alive. The Galactic Council watched in disbelief. Because in that moment, the truth became impossible to deny. Humanity had not returned to fight a war. They had returned to end one. And they had done it so completely that the galaxy barely had time to realize it had been saved. The Council tried to reclaim control. In the wake of the Dominion's erasure, emergency sessions filled the ancient halls once more. Borders were reaffirmed. Authority was restated. Committees formed to oversee reconstruction, defense alignment, and post-crisis stability. The Council spoke as if order had endured because of its foresight, as if events had unfolded within acceptable margins. It was too late. The galaxy remembered. Worlds remembered the silence while they burned. Species remembered the debates that outlasted entire civilizations. Survivors remembered who hesitated and who arrived. The Council still had fleets. They still had laws. They still had traditions measured in millennia. But power had shifted. Humanity did not step forward to rule. They refused every offer. Permanent council seats. Supreme military authority. Emergency governance mandates. Each proposal was acknowledged, considered, and declined with the same calm finality. "We are not here to govern," came the final human transmission. "Governance creates dependence." Dependence creates failure. Instead, humanity shared what it had learned in isolation. Stabilization frameworks capable of repairing planetary damage once thought irreversible. Defensive architectures designed to prevent extinction, not to project dominance. Infrastructure models built on redundancy rather than efficiency, on endurance rather than elegance. They helped rebuild. Then they left. Humanity did not dismantle the Council. They made it irrelevant. Across the galaxy, something subtle and irreversible changed. Species stopped assuming someone else would protect them. Defense replaced prestige. Preparation replaced complacency. The illusion that safety could be outsourced, to ancient powers, to treaties, to distant authorities, began to fade. The Council still existed, but it no longer defined survival. And humanity, they faded back into the dark. Not hiding, not isolated, waiting. Human space remained distant and undefined, its borders unmapped, its fleets unseen. They did not occupy trade routes. They did not demand recognition. They existed beyond known space, where sensors strained and certainty failed. Watching, listening, enduring. The Council never again spoke of underestimating humanity. They never dared. Because the galaxy now understood a truth that could not be voted away, negotiated down, or forgotten. Humanity did not need to rule to matter. They did not need permission to act. They did not need gratitude to protect existence. They had survived abandonment. They had endured isolation. They had ended an extinction-level threat without becoming conquerors. And that changed the meaning of power forever. So when the stars finally grew quiet, when the Dominion became history instead of terror, one certainty spread across the galaxy, whispered between worlds and etched into every serious archive. If darkness rises again, humanity will be there.